All right, well, I want to talk a little more about some of the protesters outside of NATO this weekend. One of the biggest events was a march led by Iraq Veterans Against the War, but also included thousands of veterans of the war in Afghanistan and various other anti-war protesters as well. Now, one of the things that sort of made me stop in my tracks was when many of them took their medals and threw them on the streets of Chicago, not far from where the NATO summit was held. Take a look at this.
I was in Iraq in '03, and what I saw there crushed me. I don't want to suffer this again, and I don't want our children to suffer this again. So I'm giving these back.
One by one, 45 veterans spoke of their own anger or pain, and each turned and threw their medals toward McCormick Place.
It's a good conduct medal.
Many veterans called their medals representations of hate and cheap tokens. Some also made some pretty emotional pleas, begging for forgiveness from the people of Iraq and Afghanistan, from the children left without parents. Many also ended their statements calling for Bradley Manning to be freed. Joining me is Joe Macaray, Development and Communications Associate at Truth Out, and an editor and contributor at the occupied Chicago Tribune. Hey, Joe, thanks so much for being here. I guess I want to talk a little bit about what we just saw, some really powerful video. I was sort of watching the live stream of it earlier. I mean, do you think people were surprised? 45 veterans throwing their medals into the street?
Right, and it should be noted that the reason they were throwing them where they did is that this is the closest that this march was permitted to get to the NATO summit. They had wanted to return the medals to the NATO generals, but this march, had to stop at the fence where it did. So some of them threw them on the ground, some of them threw them over the fence there. But it was an extremely powerful emotional moment. One of them said, some of us have killed innocent people, and then there are others who are not here right now because they've killed themselves. Some of them are people who had discharges, dishonorable discharges or other than honorable discharges. Others were people who had actually deserted. At least one veteran said that they had deserted, and there were veterans who couldn't be there but wanted to be because they had deserted, left the country, and would face legal proceedings if they returned to the United States.
It's just so interesting because so often you see, people from our parents' generation, people wearing tie-dye, those very peaceful anti-war people, but to see so many people, men and women, in their 20s, recently, some of them very recently, back from serving in Afghanistan, to be talking about this. I mean, what impact do you think this will have? A lot of times, very traditionally, in this country, we see, a very pro-military, support the troops, just kind of a wave in this country that steers the energy and the excitement towards the military. This is not what we saw.
Right, and it's important to note that while this was a joint delegation between the Iraq Veterans Against the War and Afghans for Peace, and while they were very clear to emphasize that the people of Afghanistan and Iraq have been the primary victims of those wars, the troops are victims as well a lot of the time. I mean, in the United States, who fights the wars? It's not the people who make the decisions to go to war. It's the people who are, the 99%. We have a kind of economic conscription in this country, and I think that's something that was reflected. Another really interesting thing is to contrast. In fact, there's a piece of Truth Out about this right now by Jesse Meyerson, to contrast what the veterans were saying about having come to realize that their orders were immoral and having come to regret the violence they took part in, to contrast that with what subsequently happened on the streets in Chicago, which is the violence that took place with the Chicago Police Department and state police beating protesters who were, basically unarmed.
Yeah, really interesting seeing some of those pictures coming out this weekend. The protests just looked huge. In terms of the protests that we've been covering over the last year, Occupy Wall Street certainly being one of the biggest up to this point. And I'm curious, I want to ask you, because I know you've covered Occupy since the beginning. How did this compare with what you saw over the last several months with Occupy in Oakland, in New York, here in D.C., all of the above?
Well, I mean, I've been focused on Chicago, and this has definitely been Chicago's moment in the spotlight, as it were. Despite the fact that the protesters didn't want this summit to happen, I think that the Occupy movement here knew that this would really be the time when the whole world would be watching. And there have been some really important connections made between visitors from Occupy movements all across the country, and indeed outside of the United States, with Occupy Chicago. Occupy Chicago is important not just because I live there. No, that's not just why I find it one of the most interesting Occupy movements. It's also because there's a desire on the part of some people in the Democratic Party to co-opt Occupy and to use it as a way to, as further fuel for the election, and to say the Republicans are the party of the 1%, Democrats stand for the 99%. But in Chicago, we're a one-party city, essentially, and the mayor is someone who is very close to Obama's administration, and the NATO summit is an event at which Obama was present. So to have this protest in Chicago, in this city, against this summit, I think have it so be something that the Occupy movement nationwide was involved in, makes it clear that this is not a movement that is going to support the Democrats for as long as they continue to engage in policies overseas that are essentially wars fought on behalf of the global 1%.
It's interesting, too. I mean, certainly just having it in Chicago wasn't the reason that NATO was so big. It's big every year. A lot of topics certainly drew a lot of people who wanted to come out and voice their opinion. But what they do every year with a lot of these summits is they set up, they know the protesters are coming, so they set up free speech zones. They say, all right, protesters, stay behind this line or behind this fence or 2 miles away from where the summit's going to be held. That happened. But also there were plenty of, anarchists and black bloc protests who wanted to protest where they wanted to protest. Kind of break this down for me, how this happens and what the point of that is.
Right. I think it's important to make a distinction between three separate things. One is anarchists as an ideology and as a sort of political persuasion. Not everyone who identifies as an anarchist gets involved in black bloc tactics. Then you have black bloc as a tactic, which is people who dress in black, who move as a group, and who tend to be more confrontational with the police and might do things like link arms and try and push through a police line. And then in a third category, you have people who just choose not to disperse when a police order to disperse is given, or who choose to go on a march or join a march that doesn't have a permit. There were very few permits granted for this weekend, and two of the permits that were granted for the rally in Daley Plaza on Friday, and then the march to McCormick Place yesterday, they changed the routes. They threatened to revoke the permits. So there was a lot of marching without a permit. And Occupy Chicago likes to say that the First Amendment is their permit. And you can see why, clearly there are people who believe that they should be allowed to protest in the street when they want, not on the police's terms.
Absolutely. Sometimes when you got to get your message out, you can't wait for the authorities to tell you where to do so. Joe McElroy, Development and Communications Director, Associate at Truth Out, also an editor at the Occupied Chicago Tribune. Thanks so much.
No problem. Thanks for having me.